So, as 2021 breaks out, and we start seeing where we're heading in this wonderful dystopian world we've created for ourselves, new and interesting things are happening. With 2020 finally in the books and gone beyond, I know it was the longest decade ever. I know it was for me. It's time for us to start looking forward as to where we can go from here and what to do. And so I know many people have different ideas for how we can do that. And one that's popped up was put out by a man named Klaus Schwab. For those of you who don't know, Klaus Schwab is the person who founded the World Economic Forum, which is a forum where leaders of the nations of the world go, along with experts, and discuss economics and world issues and things of that nature. It's held in Davos, and I know that it gets some flack from people, especially on the left, but from the right too, especially since it's very much kind of an air of almost central planning for the world. And I mean, having nations talk to each other and try to do like trade treaties, which they've done there before, right? They talk about trade and they talk about economics and ways that the two countries can benefit each other, and that's all good. But at the same time, there's a lot of influence, and there's a lot of influence peddling that goes there. And you don't get it let in the door unless you're someone. And frankly, that someone is not any of us. But it does lend itself to the idea that there's a cultural elite that's allowed in, and the unwashed masses, quote unquote, are not. And so, while I don't usually buy into crap like that, when Klaus Schwab came out with the Great Reset, which when I first heard of it, I thought it was like one of those conspiracy theory tinfoil hat things. The New York Times said it was a conspiracy theory, and then Time said it wasn't. And then you go to the World Economic Forum website, and there's a whole microsite for the Great Reset. And they've got a whole lot of different videos and information on it. I've seen the trailer for it. I put quite a bit of time into it. I've watched a few documentaries on it, both from various pundits, but they include Tim Pool and Glenn Beck, and I know that they each have their biases, and I'm not saying they're perfect, not by a long shot, but I want you to know where I got some of my information from. And then I went to the website and I started digging. And so here's where I want you to know that I got everything I'm about to read for you. Everything I'm about to read to you comes from the World Economic Forum website, or was sourced from their website or one of their resources. This was not sourced from any of the other pundits or commentators out on the interwebs. I think it's very important to let you know that, just so in the interests of full disclosure, you know where I'm coming from. So from the World Economic Forum's website, this is a direct quote, weforum.org/great-reset/, and these are both forward slashes, of course. The context, quote, "The COVID-19 crisis and the political, economic, and social disruptions it has caused is fundamentally changing the traditional context for decision-making. The inconsistencies, inadequacies, and contradictions of multiple systems, from health and financial to energy and education, are more exposed than ever amidst a global context of concern for lives, livelihoods, and the planet. Leaders find themselves at a historic crossroads, managing short-term pressures against medium and long-term uncertainties." Now, all of this sounds pretty good, but there's a lot of implications here, and that's what we're going to get into today. So buckle up. We're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. The Julien McBain Show is apparently brought to you by the dead of night on Toulon, because I can never seem to do a video when it's not nightfall. Okay, so let's take the context. Son of a bitch. Elbow hits the mouse. Let's take the context of what the Great Reset is supposed to be and break it down a little bit. The COVID-19 crisis has in fact caused political, economic, and social disruptions. We have more or less all been under martial law for the better part of a year. Some places it's more martial law-y than others. My state, I'm fairly lucky. as long as you stay within the boundaries of the state, you're good. But if you leave the state, you're under house arrest for 2 weeks. If you're in New York, you're just under house arrest because New York doesn't believe in the Constitution. So it has changed a lot of the ways that we think and the ways that we act. And it's fundamentally shifted these things. And we have very quickly gotten used to these different methods of acting. And they call out the inconsistencies, inadequacies, and contradictions of multiple systems. Basically what they're calling out here, now I can see where, if you've got multiple systems within a single governing structure, that can be an issue. And I'm talking for the United States in particular, it would be within the state level. And I know there's a lot of people worldwide, especially outside of the United States, who look at the way we do things in the U.S. and scratch their heads because in other nations, other federated nations like Canada or Mexico, Germany, the federal government has primacy, or it's the primacy clause. It's when there's two laws that contradict each other, the federal law takes precedence. In the United States, it's actually the opposite in most cases. In the U.S., for my international folks as well as my U.S. folks, if they write down a law or mandate or anything like that, and that is not a power delegated to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution, the states can ignore it. And in fact, a lot of states often do. This is how we have some states where marijuana is legal and other states where marijuana is not. It's because the primacy law only applies if it is a power delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. And so this is why each state has had a different approach to how it handles coronavirus. And some of it has worked better than others. You'll find like Florida and South Dakota where they have had spikes, but the numbers per 100,000 are actually relatively low. They're not great, but they're definitely better than some other places, even though they've been completely open. And there are different cultural factors for that, especially in South Dakota where you can go... I've lived in North Dakota. I loved visiting South Dakota. One of my best friends is there. There are places in South Dakota where you can look and you see that house over there, that house over yonder, yeah, that one over there, yeah, it's 5 miles away. So there's definite context to be had there. But you put this in. But if you match this up against a place like New York, which is pretty much the epicenter of coronavirus, largely speaking, in the United States. I know it's kind of shifted a little bit between there and California, but for the most part, New York has definitely been on that list, especially New York City, where they've had hard lockdowns. And part of that's because of the leadership, and part of that's because of the culture. And everyone's like, well, why can't we have a national mask mandate? Because the president doesn't have that power. So this is where the idea that inconsistencies, inadequacies, and contradictions of multiple systems comes in. Because those are the multiple systems. In the U.S., if we had a federal government that did have primacy, they could have just top-down ordered everyone to do something, and that's the way it would have been done. Because we don't have that, much like the European Union, I don't exactly know how the EU works. There's some ideas that I think they call it the European Council, whatever their legislative body is for the European Union, has a certain amount of primacy. But at the same time, all of the nations therein are technically sovereign. And they're not just internally sovereign like U.S. states, they're externally sovereign as well. Like, we don't send an ambassador to the European Union. We send an ambassador to Germany and to France. And so I don't know... And maybe that's because it's a work in process, and eventually it'll be a lot more like the U.S. system where the internal states within are administered as subunits. But that's not the way it is now. But it does create a bunch of different systems. And to be fair to Klaus Schwab, he is technically correct. There are a lot of inconsistencies. There's inefficiencies there when you don't have a one-world system. Here's the problem. Different peoples and different cultures handle issues differently. Some will be better at some things, some will be better at others, and some people just won't give a fuck. So here's where you have to have those multiple systems to handle things in the way that the culture of a particular area is going to be willing to handle it. Does that mean that sometimes we don't always have the most efficient response to things? Yes. Is that unfortunate? Yes. Is there some sort of magic bullet to fix that? That probably wasn't the best allegory. No. Unless, of course, the idea is to create a one-world government. I know there used to be like a lot, like the big tinfoil hat conspiracy was the New World Order garbage. And to a certain extent, I can see where they were trying to kind of head that way with the UN, but not really, because everyone knew that would never fucking happen. But as we get through this, it appears that's kind of the way the direction they're looking to push things. And that's just not going to work. So we're going to keep going. We're probably going to revisit this topic at some point. But the fact of the matter is I think he got a lot of the symptoms right. I think his solution is bad overall. But let's go through it. I encourage you to go to the World Economic Forum's website, look through all the things, read it all, and make a decision for yourself. I'm going to give you my impression of it. I have heard it called a number of things, all of them pejorative and for good reason. I've heard it called modern communism. I've heard it called fascism. I've heard it called neo-feudalism. Depending on what part you're reading, all three within the context would not be inaccurate economically speaking. And keep in mind, all of these systems aren't like Chinese communism. It's not just the fact that there's an authoritarian top-down government. There's an economic system therein. And the economic system would still be similar even if it didn't have the gigantic authoritarian government. It just happens to be their economic system encourages an authoritarian government. The economics of fascism operate in a certain way. And actually, this is something I'm going to visit at some point because it's an interesting anomaly because of the way people view fascism versus what it actually was. And the only thing everyone understands, because this is fundamentally true, is that fascism is bad. Well, yes, it is bad. But everyone, because of when it was put into place, everyone assumes fascism is bad because it is inherently based on race politics. And that's actually incorrect. Fascism is actually an economic system built upon an authoritarian government. It just happened to be that the people who put those things into place were a bunch of racist asshats. So, and the neo-feudalism is its own thing, which actually, to a certain extent, isn't bad on its face, but you can guarantee it's going to have bad outcomes. But we're going to keep going, and you'll figure out why I'm saying all these things as we go. Okay. So, Klaus Schwab asserts that COVID-19 has disrupted everything. I got through all that. Looking through my production notes, I managed to push through half of them without even realizing it. Okay, so what is the solution? Here's what they say the opportunity is. And here is where I start to really get concerned because, like I said, I think the diagnosis is largely correct. It is. But I don't think that his solution is correct. So the opportunity, quote, as we enter a unique window of opportunity to shape the recovery, this initiative will offer insights to help inform all of those determining the future state of global relations, the direction of national economies, the priorities of societies, the nature of business models, and the management of a global commons. Drawing from the vision and vast expertise of the leaders engaged across the can't read my own handwriting. Across the forum's communities, the Great Reset Initiative has a set of dimensions to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being. Okay, there is a lot to unpack here, so let's dive in. We have a unique window of opportunity to shape the recovery. In other words, what they want to do is take advantage of the crisis to reshape the world in an image that they have created. This is not the first time people have done this. And in fact, that's basically what we did in Europe and Japan back after World War II, because let's face it, both places were completely demolished by the war, often at our hands. So I understand where they're coming from. It's like, okay, shit's done got bad. So since shit's done got bad, we have an opportunity to fix some of the problems that were in the old system that would have been almost impossible had not shit not done got bad, because it would have caused things to get bad before it got better. And you don't want to break a system that's functioning, even if it's kind of wonky. But the system doesn't work right now because, well, we kind of deliberately broke it due to a virus. Okay, that's fair. I don't like the idea of taking advantage of a crisis, but at the same time, I can see where they're coming from. So I'll give them that, even if I think it's just a little bit shady. So, help inform all those determining the future state of global relations, the direction of national economies, the priorities of society. Okay. The way this is worded, and this might just be because of the way German culture works, because Klaus Schwab is, of course, German. He's from South Germany, and he was born, ironically, in 1938. And so his childhood was shaped by those experiences. So Nazi Germany fell when he was like 7. And then you had the occupation that he lived in for a long time. Now, fortunately for him, he was in West Germany, so he did not witness the East German form of Soviet communism, but I am sure that his decisions are informed by a lot of those days. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. It's good that he has the ability to look back with with those experiences in mind. But I'm looking at this, and I'm sure, and it assumes a great centralization of power. See, in the United States and in a lot of countries, most of your republics or democracies have decentralized power. And I don't know how a lot of other places work. I do know how the U.S. works, so I'm going to use the U.S. as the model. Please look at the way your own nation works if you are not in the U.S., just so you can kind of look at how that works and see where the difference would be. In the United States, we have multiple layers of government, all the way from the top, where you have the president, the legislature, and Supreme Court, which rule the federal government, essentially. They have their parts to play in the organization and operation of the federal government. Down to the states, where you have the governors and the legislatures within the states, which mirror our federal legislature, the bicameral House, the executive branch, and a court system to match. All of that's good. But then they break down again to county and municipal governments. And so, in the United States, central planning just won't function. And part of that's because of that whole 10th Amendment thing, where if it's not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, the states can just say, you know what, Uncle Sam, fuck you. Because we ain't doing that shit. And the states have. My state has a couple of times, in fact. And so, this is the first criticism of the Great Reset. It assumes and necessitates a large amount of centralized power. It means delegating to the executive branches of various nations a vast amount of power to execute the plan. And that's not going to work in some places, or would require a fundamental and systemic shift in how those nations operate. Once again, I am most familiar with the U.S. system, which is very decentralized on purpose. Other nations I know work differently. This would probably be work much more effectively in Japan, or in the Koreas, or in China, or in perhaps even France or Germany or Canada. And I think even Canada is slightly more decentralized than some of the more European nations. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I've got any Canadian audience members. So this is where this would break down, is they assume centralized power. It necessitates centralized power. And so that's problem number one. Problem number two. What gives that centralized power the right to decide the direction of where their whole nation goes? So basically what they're saying is that we have to centrally plan the economy. We have to centrally plan how our society is going to build itself. We're going to have a planning committee or a steering committee, or even a one person, unlikely. It'll probably be a committee, because, a committee is the only thing that's human, has more than 2 legs and no brain. And so what they do is they decide where we're going to go with this. And then say, okay, here's the decision made, go do it. Now, in all likelihood, it wouldn't function like that. Like here, they do things in committee, they'd offer it up to the legislative bodies. The legislative bodies would have to review it, they'd make amendments, it'd go back to committee, it'd get shuffled around for a couple of years, and then maybe it'd come to a vote, and then if it doesn't get vetoed, it goes to law. That's basically how everything works in the United States. And I know that other nations have similar bodies that function in a similar manner, adjusted for their own cultural backgrounds. But the fact of the matter is it means that you're in a central plan just about everything. And what that means is a fundamental shift in how we look at economics. See, we've done the central planning thing before, and it resulted in almost 100 million deaths. And yes, when I say central planning, I'm talking about communism. Even if we take it out of the context of communism, that's basically what we're looking at. And that doesn't mean that just by this, the idea of puritanical communism where people don't own anything and there's no private property. No, that may not be the case, but at the same time, it means there's no freedom to decide what you want to do for a job, or even if you can decide which company to work for. If you're an innovator, you can't decide whether or not your product is going to go to shelves. That's been planned for you. And so there's a lot of authoritarianism built into it, even if it's unintentional. This makes me very nervous because authoritarian regimes have a nasty habit of turning more authoritarian as people in power realize that, oh, I have all this power. Well, why don't I just see if I can get away with this? So that's concerning. The other thing is that it says drawing from the vision and vast expertise of leaders engaged across the forum's communities. So it gives a lot of power to the forum itself as well. The forum will be that central planning committee for the world. And so basically what Klaus Schwab has done, by implication, if not explicitly, is state that I've got this great idea. We're going to do it all. Everyone has to have buy-in, and by the way, my body or organization is going to be the one directing everything. Do you think there might be a little self-interest in there, Klaus? I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of self-interested. Now, to be fair, if you're going to set something up like this, of course you're going to offer yourself to be the leader of it. You're not going to say, oh, I've got this solution, but I'm not going to participate. One, that'd be disingenuous. So, okay, fine, fair enough. But two, it would also show that you don't want to put any skin in the game. Obviously, he's offering the forum up to be that body, which puts his own reputation on the line. So he's definitely putting his skin in the game. I'll give him that. That being said, having read and listened to some of the works of Klaus Schwab, I don't really trust the guy as far as I can throw him. So, okay. Been through this. The issues I have with this idea, beyond the whole central planning thing, is that he ignores cultural differences between states and nations. He assumes that if someone tells everyone across the world to do things, and you have buy-in from the world leaders, the people are just going to go along with it. And maybe some of the more collectivized cultures will do that, but not in a lot of your Western nations where individualism kind of reigns. It ignores cultural differences. And I think that assumption's fairly arrogant. So there's a lot of problems there. And that doesn't mean that the idea couldn't work to a certain extent, but it means it's not going to work overall. At least not the way he wants it to work. So with all of that, we come to this new concept he came up with. And this is where things get bad. Here is where I start to reject it wholesale. Like, I like the pie in the sky idea because if you look at it and you read it and you're a Star Trek fan, you're reading it and you're going, this sounds a little bit like the United Federation of Planets. And I like the idea of a United Federation of Planets. To do that, you have to have a united Earth first. not only because assuming that there isn't contact with aliens yet, which according to some government officials, including our retired House Majority Leader Harry Reid, we've already had contact with them, and there's already a galactic federation. I'm not going to unpack that on this episode, but I had to throw that out there. You've got the idea that if we have a one world government, we can all focus on reaching the stars. And that sounds great on its face, except for all the problems I've already laid out. Do I think we'll eventually get there? Yes. Do I think we're going to get there in my lifetime? Probably not. Because to do that, we have to have a single governing structure that everyone can agree upon, and we don't. And I think that the way that would have to work, there's only two ways that it could work, right? Way number one is a heavily authoritarian Starship Troopers fascist type of place. Chinese communism would technically work too, although there's a lot of issues that would come up with that type of a system, like the fact that, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for innovation, because if you step out of line, you get disappeared, 1984 style. But, and the reason I say that, the former would work slightly better is because, and maybe I'm wrong, historically, and thankfully fascism was very short-lived, relatively speaking. When fascism came up, they focused on military buildup, which made them innovate, which made them build rockets, which is how we got to the moon. We got to the moon because of Germany, because we stole all their scientists after the war was over, and gave them clemency for some really horrendous shit. That being said, both systems are awful. So what's the solution? The other option is to use a model similar to what we have in the States or what they have in the European Union. This would work very well. There's a lot of issues around it. It has some inconsistencies in the fact that because they're all federated, you'd end up with, basically the UN being the ruling body, and everyone knows that the UN is useless because no one can ever fucking agree on anything. But I do think we'll eventually get there. So, top-down authoritarianism, not going to work. Well, would technically work, but everyone's got a shitty life. Or dispersed federalism, which is great for the people, but really hard to organize. But anyway, I digress. Comes out with the idea of stakeholder capitalism. And this is terrifying. See, stakeholder capitalism is what they do in China. It's also what they did in Nazi Germany. So, yeah, this is where shit done gets bad. And here's where I look at Klaus Schwab and I go, because here's how stakeholder capitalism works. And understand that I've got to do more reading into it, but I have looked into this. I read it a couple of months ago. I was going to read it again. I couldn't find the goddamn resource. I know it's on the WE Forum, the World Economic Forum website. I just got to figure out which one of the links that they posted up there it was. Stakeholder capitalism basically works this way. So currently we have a mixed economy currently with shareholder capitalism, largely speaking. What that means is you can invest in a company or start a company. You own shares in that company. You pay the expenses of the company, which includes employee salaries and wages. And then of what's left, it's broken down into by share, and you get a dividend based on the profits of the company. If the company hits a loss, you don't make anything. Okay, that's pretty mathematically functional. This allows for some unique business models. You've got the B Corp, which is more social activist. You've got the cooperative, where everyone in the company has a single voting share. And I've heard them called socialist companies, and that's fundamentally inaccurate because the way they work is much different. But everyone gets an individual voting share, and all other investments are non-voting. This is a very interesting way to do things, and I've seen a lot of companies be very successful with this, because when you have employee buy-in, they tend to work harder because they're doing it in their own self-interest. This is good. But the most important part is the government keeps its nose out beyond certain regulatory things like, oh, I don't know, making sure that you can't have employees have machines where their hair is going to get stuck into it so it kills them. You know, kind of like happened during the Industrial Revolution. This is the entire reason that unions ended up getting formed. And then they became extremely corrupt. So, not all of them to be fair, but many of them. So, okay. The idea is that with stakeholder capitalism, they do private-public partnerships. The government owns a stake in every company, helps direct what that company makes. This is literally economic fascism. And I don't mean that from the authoritarian murder a certain race direction, but this is the economics of fascism. Go look it up. It's also largely how the Chinese Communist Party does things. And I'm not saying the Chinese Communist Party is fascist. It's not. It's communist. There is a difference. Economically, they're very, very similar because they're collectivized economies. When China liberalized its economy from direct central planning to more distributed planning, it basically took economic fascism and implemented that part into Chinese communism while keeping the rest of it communist. But what it means is government's going to have a hand in what people produce. The companies will be private, but they produce what the government tells them to first. This is how Nazi Germany ended up getting their war machine going. This is not hyperbole. This is history. Go look it up. It's out there. I spent 12 years researching this shit. Okay? And when I first heard about this and they were commenting on how this, I'm like, no, that couldn't possibly be. And then I read it and I'm like, that's exactly how Nazi Germany came out of the Depression. That's literally what they're doing. And I'm not saying this is because Schwab is German, although it may be informed by it, because, you know, for better or for worse, they were really good at getting the Germans out of the hole they had been sunk into, mostly by the Treaty of Versailles. And let's be honest, guys, the Allies are the reason that Hitler rose to power, and it's because of the way we sank their economy. And that's why Nazism, which also uses fascist economics, National Socialism is very similar to fascism. It is different. Maybe at some point I'll do a whole podcast on totalitarian, or even a series on totalitarian 20th century government systems, because they were all a bit unique, and all of them need to be understood for their issues so that we can understand how to avoid them. Because just because something works doesn't mean it isn't awful. So okay. The government has its share in each company, and then the investors have their share in each company, and then the workers have their share in each company. And on its face, it sounds really good. Unfortunately, it means there's a lot of problems. When the government can decide whether or not you're allowed to produce a widget rather than the market, what ends up happening is you end up with shortages. And this is what happened in Soviet Russia, because the government technically owned everything. They never truly liberalized until Perestroika, and they kind of passed through this private-public thing until everything got privatized with the current Russian Federation. But what it does mean is we have to be aware of what this could mean. Because where economic fascism comes, governance often follows. Because fascist regimes weren't authoritarian on their face from day one. They implemented fascist economic systems, which worked really well. I'm not going to deny that. Their economic system does function rather well for the most part, as long as you constantly have something to produce. The easiest thing to produce is weapons. And then all the assholes come out of the woodwork. So this is why this makes me nervous. Because these things that they're proposing, when informed by history, are just a bad idea. And he calls to revamp everything, like all of society. Does this not sound familiar? There are numerous manifestos out there that sound exactly like this. One was written by Karl Marx, one was written by Adolf Hitler. So I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm just very, very concerned. And I think you should be too. And I encourage you, go to the World Economic Forum website. Look up the Great Reset. Time just put out an article. I didn't have time to read it before I had to do this production. But they're not even... This isn't a conspiracy theory. They're not hiding it. They're telling us what they want to do. They're just coming out and saying it. And part of me is like, are they saying the quiet part out loud? And it's like, no, because no one's paying attention. Well, I can't say that. Relative to the population, few people are paying attention. Not enough. Especially not those of us on the ground where we're not the people in power. So, let's understand why they think this is important beyond the coronavirus. Because they make some good points, but again, I think their solution is awful. They cite the growing wealth gap as a contributing issue. We do have a wealth gap issue in the world. The thing is, though, is that wealth gap is predicated on the ridiculous amount of growth we've had and the absurd amount of innovation we've had over the last 50 years. Just in the last 30, we've gone from 8-track tapes. Well, okay. 8 tracks were kind of already out of date by the time I was 6. But let's say, well, no, because we had an 8-track player in the first car that I remember. My parents were thrilled when they got a regular cassette player. In the last 50 years, we've gone from hardly any data to magnetic data forms, your 8 tracks, your Betamaxes, to VHS, to DVD, and CD and DVD. We had laser discs somewhere in there, which looked like vinyls, but they were for video. First time I watched Star Wars was actually on a laser disc. And Popeye. My uncle owned one. And now we have, within the span of a single generation, okay? Within the span of a single generation's lifetime, we've gone from physical notches in a round piece of metal to track data, or using magnetic resources to track data, to digital data, where you can pack huge amounts of data on a chip about the size of my thumb. And so because of that, those innovators made a lot of money. And this is all because of the 80-20 rule. This is because of the Pareto principle. This was going to happen. But here's the disingenuous part about the argument, how they've got this huge wealth gap. Despite, or maybe because of that wealth gap, the number of people that have been pulled out of absolute poverty has never been higher. The number of people in absolute poverty has never been lower in the history of the world. Because as the rich get richer, they are pulling the poor up with them. It may not look like it. You may scoff at the idea. But they are. And it may be slow. Maybe it's not as fast as you want it to be. You know what? Okay, fine. That's a debatable point. But they are pulling the poor up with them, which is why the number of people in absolute poverty has never been lower, and it's shrinking every day. This does not require central planning. And he asserts that if left unaddressed, people will be less equal, less sustainable, and the world will be less equal, less sustainable, and more fragile. I disagree with this. Less equal depends on your definition. See, I'm a firm believer in equality of opportunity. Everyone should have, within reason, an equal opportunity to achieve their best outcomes. Right? You should have the opportunity to achieve your best outcomes. This means you have the opportunity to go to school. You get educated, right? And this is where I kind of fall off the bandwagon with a lot of libertarians, because a lot of libertarians think everything should be 100% privatized, your ANCAPs and stuff. And I love the idea of it, but much like universal healthcare, it's just not going to work. So, and I know I just triggered a bunch of people by saying that. So, now that I've lost my whole audience, the fact of the matter is, in order for person A and person B, person A comes from a rich household, person B comes from a poor one. They both go to school for 12 years. They both graduate with their diploma. They both have the opportunity to go to college. The rich person's probably going to get out of college with no debt, and the poor person's going to have debt. That creates issues, yes, but at the same time, what it doesn't do is it doesn't create a system where you're limiting the possibility of the production by forcing those who were productive to fund and finance those who have historically not been productive yet. And that may sound really utilitarian. I promise you it's not. I should probably get into economics at some point and really explain myself over that. And I say this as someone with a lot of college debt. Like, if I didn't have any college debt right now, I would be in a lot better shape. I probably would have been able to buy my car cash instead of on lease. Debt does perpetuate itself. But the reason this is a problem is, and this is deliberate, the schools do this shit on purpose, and this is a soapbox I'm going to stand on until the day I fucking die. The schools deliberately do not educate people in a way to make sure those opportunities are equal. Because they don't teach people how to manage their goddamn money, because they do things on an ideological basis rather than a mathematical basis. So instead, what their solution is, we're just going to central plan everything, and we're going to head for equality of outcomes. Which means it doesn't matter how productive you could be, if Johnny over there isn't able to keep up with you, you've got to limit where you go. And that's what I see here. And maybe I'm wrong. If Klaus Schwab wants to come out and correct me, or one of the people who work for the World Economic Forum, I am more than happy to listen. But that's how this reads. That's what stakeholder capitalism is. And they want to sweep away the whole old system. Like, it's in the literature. They literally say, we're going to sweep away the whole old system and rebuild a unified one from the ground up. No, they use the term foundation. Which, you know me, I'm a Mason, so I love building metaphors. They want to lay a new foundation over the rubble of the old one. Or actually, they probably bulldoze the rubble out of the way so they can have a nice smooth surface, frame it out correctly, pour that basement, put the bricks on top. You know, they got to make sure that everything's nice and even going up. And the best part is we don't get a choice in the matter. The leaders decide. They don't mention it anywhere in this where the people get a say. They say leaders and experts, the elite, the aristocracy, the technocracy. These things I've hammered on about. And I always thought, you know, I sound like a tinfoil hat, except they're just saying it. They're saying it. And it's like, are they saying the quiet part out loud? I know I've said that before today, but that's what I wonder. But no one seems to notice. And the best part of this all is it requires greater centralization, more powerful government. Do we really want more powerful government? I mean, from my perspective, the best government is the government that simply protects your rights, those three basic human rights of life, liberty, and property, and then stays the hell out of your life. You know, maybe lay some infrastructure so our lives are a little bit easier, like, you know, making sure that there's no lead in the pipes, because that's life, right? Protect life by making sure that companies aren't doing things that are sleazy, like putting lead in the pipes. Even though, you know, Rome lived on lead pipes for their entire existence. Not saying that was a good thing. Lead poisoning was and diseases from lead poisoning were a major problem in Rome. They never figured it out, though. Maybe that's why the Dark Ages happened the way they did. Everyone was just lead poisoned and couldn't think straight. To quote them, they want to steer the market toward fairer outcomes. They literally said fairer outcomes, which means equality of outcome. Stakeholder capitalism. This is the dystopia that we're heading toward. This is why I say we're in a cyberpunk dystopia, because this is basically the theme of every cyberpunk novel and game ever. Okay? Megacorps. Megacorps that run things. When you merge government and corporations, you've created the very background that all cyberpunk things are based off of, which is why my podcast has its theme. And I know, I got animated today. I'm sorry. After reading all the notes, reviewing some of the information that was out there on it, after listening, and Klaus Schwab has a whole book on it. And honestly, at this point, I'm probably going to give the guy enough money of my money so I can read the book, or at least listen to it on audio, to really dive into the weeds in this and really understand what he's planning. But the fact of the matter is, the things that concern me is that he's stating outright what he wants. It's very centralized. The people don't get a say. And he says there's obligatory buy-in from everyone, from the United States to China. Literally in the literature, he says from the United States to China, everyone must participate for this to work. And he's right. For his idea to work, everyone needs to participate in it. But he also doesn't appear to account for the option of the people saying, you know, we kind of think that's a bad idea. He says the leaders must buy in. Not the people, not their duly elected representatives, the leaders. And maybe the representatives are the leaders. I don't trust it. And I don't think you should either. So, I don't know. Drop a comment. Let me know. I know we touched on a lot of kind of hairy things tonight. And there's still more to unpack. There's so much more to unpack. But this is the direction I think we're heading. And that motto that's been kicked around Europe a lot, and it came into U.S. presidential politics with Joe Biden, who is the presumptive president-elect. We'll find out on January 6th, I think, is when they count the electoral votes. I mean, the votes have been cast. Everyone knows what the outcome's going to be. But on the 6th, assuming nothing goes completely harebrained sideways, Joe Biden will be determined to be the president-elect. And they all use the same motto. Boris Johnson has said it. I believe that Angela Merkel has said it. The phrase is Build Back Better. And that comes from the World Economic Forum. And so, obviously, the United States government has buy-in, at least at the executive level, or the future executive level. Europe has buy-in. So, I don't know. Maybe this is the direction we go, and we aren't going to have an opportunity to stop it. Or maybe people will look at it, figure out what's going on, and say, hey, you know, I'm Minuten bitte. Because if we don't stop it, if we don't change direction and try to not go in this, you know, toward this stakeholder capitalism, all we're doing is inviting more authoritarianism, whether it's by accident or design. And we've already seen a lot of authoritarianism in light of the COVID-19 crisis. We've got several governors who have become tin pot dictators in the United States. And we have just a complete disparate view of how things are as opposed to the way they used to be. And this is why I'm concerned. And that's why I started this podcast. Because we need to be a torch in the darkness, lighting the way as we navigate the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. The Julien McBain Show is a McBain Manor production. Your host is Julien McBain. That's me, aka Paul Valorant, or actually that's my real name. My moderators for whenever I'm live are Kat, Jay Lambertson, and Captain Aubrey. And thank you to my patrons, Red Kryptonite, Jay Lambertson, and Spectrum 3600 for all of your support. We will see you in the next one.